Said shut the f*** up, I'm trying to record. All right.
This is Milana Jamae Jackson, and you're listening to Jester Radio Network.
You just made the blooper reel.
Hey, this is Tony Valley.
And I'm David Gavry.
And we host a podcast called Jacking Off with Tony Valley, where every week we interview poker players and game runners about the ins and outs of the underground world of poker.
And we discuss strategy, philosophy, and other topics. You can listen to us on the Jester Radio Network every Thursday at 9 a.m. at jackkingoff.com, or you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play.
Hi, this is Alex Sakanikos from Bad Shorty, and you're listening to Essay Questions.
All right, well, welcome to this episode of, I think it's called Essay Questions, although that could change.
I thought I like essay questions. I don't want to go in a different direction with the title.
Well, all right, well, we don't have to change the podcast now.
Okay, cool.
I'm just saying. I'm Joe.
I'm Josh.
All right, so today we read the essay. What is this essay even called?
I think it's just called Thinking About Good and Evil. It is definitely derived from like a TED Talk he gave or something similar to that, or some kind of conference talk.
It was an excerpt from something.
It's Thinking About Good and Evil, and it's from his blog, and it's from...
it's like by Sam Harris on his blog.
Yeah, it looks like it's from 2010, so I think this is something that he has...
I think it was a speech that he gave or some sort of lecture, and he said there was excerpts that they allowed to be reprinted. But it's Sam Harris Thinking About Good and Evil. It's basically... his position that there is no moral relativism, that morality is not open to subjectivity, that there isn't objective right and wrong in the world, and he tries to explain it scientifically.
Yeah, or at least argue that we can discover it scientifically, and that there is a way to find out and to maximize human well-being and human flourishing using the same types of intellectual processes generally that we use in like scientific investigation. Essentially, I think that's a fair summary.
That's a fair way. Yeah. So it ended up being a pretty good dialogue, not just about is morality relative, but where does morality come from, and does intention influence morality, and our role historically, and how that plays both for our ancestors and those who are going to come after us, how that plays a role in their distinction of morality. I thought it was a really good talk.
Yeah, I think it went well. And I think that if I'm, without being too arrogant, I think that what we had to say was actually more interesting and more engaging than Harris's actual essay, if only because we're a lot less confident in the correctness of our evaluations. Yeah.
So feel free. I hope you guys not only enjoy the conversation, but if you want to, before the break or during the break, go read. There's going to be a link in the description to go read this essay and try to form your own opinions. And hope you guys enjoy.
All right. See you on the break.
Hi, this is Alex Sakanikos from Bad Shorty, where we roast all the favorite fantasy characters that you could even imagine. Very fan-driven. You can email us at realbadshorty@gmail.com, and we will roast anything and everything that you want us to roast. You just send them in and make sure they're not real, and we will give them the old good All right? Here on the Jester Radio Network. Thank you.
All right, so we're talking about Thinking About Good and Evil, right? By Sam Harris. So Joe, why'd you choose this essay, or what was it about this essay that intrigued you?
Sam Harris is a really polarizing figure, but I have a lot of respect for his thought process and his conclusions. I was actually looking for an essay he wrote on free will, but I guess it doesn't exist. He has a book about it, which I might want to do in the future anyway. But I've listened to his podcast a bunch. I don't know if you ever listened to it.
On occasion, yeah.
He absolutely hates the idea of moral relativism. I was glad that this essay didn't really dwell on Islam the way I thought it was going to, because that's what most of his writing dwells on, at least as of late.
Yeah.
But I've always been a big believer that morality is a relative idea, and it's just our own perspective that allows us to have those opinions about what is right, what is wrong. And it's intriguing to me because I have a lot of respect for his opinion and his brain and his thought process, that he is completely opposed to it. And I just was looking for a logical argument against my own position.
So did this essay change your mind, or at least make you refine your assumptions about morality being subjective in any way, or did it just give you like a kind of clear summary of the opposition that maybe you didn't have before?
I found myself simultaneously agreeing and disagreeing with him, because a lot of what he talks about, he basically starts from the standpoint of religion is bullshit. I mean, that's kind of his brand as a devout atheist. And so he operates from the perspective that, well, we're all conscious beings. So if we're all conscious beings, everything that's, generally good for a sentient creature, such as comfort or well-being or whatever, that's an inherent good, and we should all be able to agree on that.
Yeah.
And I completely agree that if there is a baseline agreed upon reality, if we have a shared reality, then there is a shared morality that comes along with that. If we all agree we're all alive, therefore life is for the most part good, pain is for the most part bad, we can agree upon those things. What I think he just dismisses too easily is the entire possibility that there is an existence beyond this one. And I think that's the big disconnect between what he believes and what I believe. Is I think it makes sense to operate under the assumption there is no life beyond this one. There is no other plane of existence. It makes a lot of logical sense, but I also think there's a philosophical flaw in not acknowledging that it's possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that generally. And I also, with what you said, and I also think that to take it maybe away from the idea of other realities or aspects of reality that we're not able to perceive on naturalism with our faculties and our kind of moral and philosophical presuppositions. I also think that he just assumes that there is a more or less shared understanding about, he uses the term human flourishing a lot, or he uses it a lot in conversation. I think he uses it at least once here in this essay. And I think he is really underestimating just how subjective it is to try to come up with a definition of what the good life is, or what a just society would look like, or how much or how little suffering should be tolerated in human existence. None of that stuff seems to be defined or really described in any detail here, and that would be fine for something of this length, but I'm not sure that I've ever really seen him explain that, in at least to my satisfaction, anywhere else either. So I mean, I come at this with I think there are two kind of perspectives that most people hold simultaneously, which I don't think are they don't contradict one another, and sometimes they complement each other, but they can never quite be reconciled. Which, on one hand, I believe in morality and justice. I believe that there is a value in behaving as if some things are right and wrong, and as behaving as if there might be something like absolute truth, and maybe even like a an unseen, or a different plane of existence, or God, or something that validates that sense that there might be an absolute truth. And I don't think there's really any other way to live. But on the other hand, you can't prove that or verify that rationally. So I would have to say that my attitude towards all moral and philosophical questions, great and small, it's subjective. That's just my subjective experience, and I begin with a whole bunch of assumptions that are so deep and so thorough to my experience and my very being that I probably wouldn't ever be able to describe them in enough detail, because some of them they're so deeply ingrained and I'm really conscious of them. And he wants to persuade us that there's enough shared reality among all of us as conscious beings that we can arrive at some kind of objective set of moral principles based in rationality, based in science, which also I think just raises this question of, whose rationality? I mean, there's not just one rationality. There are many ways of thinking that people have defined in the past as rational. So
do you think that there's not enough of a shared reality to make any of those distinctions?
I think that there is absolutely an opportunity to make those distinctions collectively, and we've already been doing that since the dawn of recorded time. Like our shared history, shared traditions, even when they contradict each other, even when they're in absolute opposition to each other, they are leading us towards, actually I don't want to use that word leading, they are pushing us towards some new and hopefully better or clearer understanding of our moral obligations to one another as people. I don't think that there's like a true steady progress. I think it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back at best. But I don't think that can be. I don't think that can be the authority of science or the authority of whatever Sam Harris means when he talks about rationality can be the thing that we appeal to justify our feelings of human solidarity, our feelings about morality and justice. Like we really just have to take something like a leap of faith, and I don't even think it's really just that dramatic. We just have to follow our instincts that the overwhelming majority, not all people, but the overwhelming majority of people share certain senses of what is right and wrong, what is fair and unfair, what kind of suffering is just intrinsic to human life, what kinds of suffering is unreasonable and ought to be treated as an injustice or some kind of crime, or at least be treated as a tragedy. But those are just things that we feel. I don't think you can really get any deeper than that. And I would be hard pressed for anyone to convince me that there is a way to arrive at moral conclusions on a purely rational basis. Maybe there's a big blind spot, but yeah.
That was what I was going to ask you next. Is there a certain would there certain conditions that would need to be met that would allow us to have a baseline of agreed upon morality and reality? Is there something that we don't have now that if we did, it would flip your mind about it?
I wouldn't know what it would be. I mean, I know that we meet lots of societies, and to a certain extent, we have like a bunch of unspoken shared assumptions that partly are from like kind of deracinated religious traditions, partly from the Enlightenment, partly just from all these other kind of smaller and harder to separate out sources that we're all kind of drawing from consciously or unconsciously. But that's just like within one pool of people, within one society, having some common set of authorities to appeal to like work out moral and ethical problems on a day-to-day basis, but to permanently settle moral and ethical questions by appealing to some kind of, again, absolute and objective shared aspects of human experience. I mean, it would have to be.
Well, I mean, look, okay, well, what about the concept of something like pain or murder? Like, I don't think we need far more of a baseline that we already have of agreed upon reality and experiences to identify those as bad things. Like, I think it's fair to say that, right?
Yes, and I mean, the way that we talk about it, the language that we use already carries that meaning of criminality and transgression. We talk about murder. I mean, there's no way to talk about murder in a morally kind of ambiguous or neutral
in a positive
way.
sense.
Yeah, or even like a neutral sense. But once you place those abstract moral principles into very specific contexts, all of a sudden those judgments become a lot harder to make in certain cases. And I know that there are lots of, philosophers, both just kind of popularizers and, academics for generations upon generations that have tried to puzzle out these questions. And I know too that at least to some extent, Sam Harris is one of them. But I don't know. I would still just be very hard pressed to find a kind of like closed system where we could all agree what is murder and what is just killing, what is self-defense, what is accidental death, like what all of these, potentially, like, and also it actually ties into one of the problems that I think Sam Harris is actually better at writing about, which is the one that you wanted to talk about in the first place, which is free will, because when we start talking about good and evil or moral judgments, we have to start with a discussion of how does that relate to human. If you don't like the word free will or freedom, we could talk about agency or choice. I mean, to what extent does someone who kills someone in the heat of an argument are they responsible for that murder, or is their brain, is their biochemistry, has it been essentially faded since the Big Bang?
Sure.
Like, I mean, that's all,
exactly.
Yeah,
for sure. Well, is it that we can agree upon that, for example, again, murder is bad, but what constitutes murder is open to interpretation? Is that kind of your position?
I think it's not only open to interpretation, it is constantly in need of interpretation, reinterpretation. Yeah. And it's not necessarily evolving towards something. I think it's just on a case-by-case basis, which is, quite frankly, why we have things like not just philosophy as an activity, but philosophies as in schools of thought and religious traditions and a lot of things that Sam Harris would rather us do without. They are not perfect instruments by any means, but those are the things that often help us make sense of questions that seem to be clear, questions of good and evil that seem to be quite obvious in the abstract, but when you actually add in the actual lived experiences of human reality, they suddenly become very difficult. Even in an absolutely, not absolutely, but more or less as close as we can get kind of scenario where someone has killed someone in cold blood, it's totally meaningless. It seems to be just a total act of viciousness. We are going to interpret that and think about that differently depending on whether we're just looking at it in the abstract because we have no personal investment, or whether we know any of the people involved. Like, you can't, that's where subjectivity comes in. Like, once you are connected to the actual events and not just thinking about them hypothetically, the moral framework changes completely, whether you want it to or not. So I think anytime anyone's talking about objectivity, my instinct is to think that they have this kind of deeply felt idea about what is right and wrong or what is true that is subjective to them, and they want to define their own subjective experience as objectivity.
Of course, I completely agree with that. What I kind of am going to play devil's advocate a bit on behalf of Harris for a second is there not enough of a shared reality, enough of a shared experience where we can agree for practical purposes what is right and wrong? I mean, that's kind of where laws themselves get set up, is we agree enough that theft is wrong and these are the ways that in which it should be punished to whatever degree it occurred. Or should there be more anarchism and just a lack of rules? Because I don't think that that's practical or beneficial, right? There needs to be some sort of structure, and structure is based on some sense of shared morality.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that we should live as if morality is absolutely subjective, or that morality doesn't exist, or there's no such thing as right or wrong or good and evil. I absolutely believe that there is. I just don't believe it for rational reasons. I believe it for kind of deep-seated instinctive reasons. And I think that no matter how much you embrace like scientism or materialism, at the end of the day, your sense that these things even matter comes from this intuitive and kind of not irrational but extra rational place. And there's a couple of places in the essay where Harris actually kind of I don't think he would frame it as a concession, but he talks about that there are kind of moral values that underline what he calls good science, for regardless of what we think of that characterization.
Yeah.
Let me look at the list here. There's certain like values of kind of openness and belief that kind of open debate and free discussion are morally good. The belief that we ought to make judgments based on evidence as opposed to received traditions. Yeah, he says valuing evidence, logical consistency, parsimony, and other intellectual virtues, which I don't think that those are really the values that govern science. I would be hard pressed to find all of those things or any of those things operating at certain times, say like during the Manhattan Project. But
Sure.
Yeah, but certainly those are things that Sam Harris thinks are important, and the kinds of scientists and the kinds of scientific practice that he would like to see in the world, he would like it to be like that. But again, that's just his that's just his feelings about what is good and evil, which I think he should trust those feelings, and I think a lot of people would share those feelings. But getting any deeper than that into the realm of science, which is where he wants to take this, I can't get there with him. So
I agree, but I think we kind of have somewhat shared ground where, for practical applications, there's enough that we can make these moral distinction on. It's just from a philosophical perspective, from like kind of an ethereal perspective, it's just way too open to interpretation to make any distinct decisions. Is that right?
Correct. And I think they have to be kind of, you have to make moral arguments from a place of almost, they're emotional appeals, not in a bad sense. They're appeals to, again, like human solidarity, to our shared human experience, to the idea that we wouldn't want to be treated a certain way, so therefore we're not going to treat other people this way. I mean, I don't think that science and rationality are really going to get us any further than the Golden Rule did 2,000 years ago. So that's what we operate on. We definitely have to act as a society as if good and evil exist, because I think that they do. I just can't prove it in the way that Sam Harris would like to prove it. But certainly I wouldn't want...
Well, yeah, because everyone's going to answer that question differently.
Yeah, but certainly I wouldn't want to do the opposite. I mean, as kind of weak as I find a lot of Harris's writing on the subject, certainly I'm absolutely opposed to the opposite, where we use science and rationality to try to demonstrate that morality is nothing other than a language game, and try to some kind of Nietzschean thing where we're going beyond good and evil.
Sure.
And that, I think, is a recipe for disaster. And Harris actually invokes that vision of moral relativism. It's kind of a not entirely deft moment, but I see where he's going, where he condemns, I think it's the American Sociological Association. It's one of the major kind of social sciences groups. I think it's international, or if it's just the United States. But he says that something to the effect that this is as far as our most talented or most influential social scientists were willing to go, while when
the gas chambers are still cooling. Yeah.
Which they made that statement in 1947. So no, that was it's not like, it doesn't really quite have the timeline right. Like the point he's trying to make is kind of weakened by, I mean, yes, I get what he means, and like kind of like spiritually, like that moment is still very much in the shadow of the death camps, but also it's in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. And if you use that example, suddenly the question becomes not one of what do we do, what is true, what is good, what is evil, but who do we give the power to make those decisions? I think that's also, actually, even more than what I said before, I think that's the blind spot in this essay, is that it's not about good and evil, it's about who we give power to make these kinds of
To
judgments,
make those decisions. Yeah.
I don't know. So what do you think about that? What do you think of that problem of power and authority as it relates to morality and ethics? Because it's one thing to have a conversation in the abstract, but to make a decision, someone has to have the power to enforce the decision for any society of any size. So,
I mean, that's a scary notion in and of itself, because there's no having an arbiter of right and wrong that's one of the things that has led to the ultimate tragedies in human history on virtually any scale. Any bad thing that's ever happened is because someone says, well, I know what's right, and what you're doing the opposite, that's wrong. And I mean, I suppose we can come to those conclusions, or at least the best we can, in a free society or in an open society, in a democratic society, although that's rife with problems as well, where we don't always get the best results. But that's the scariest part of the idea that there is no moral relativism, is that if we just say that there is an absolute, well, who's deciding that? And then how are our lives going to be ruined or enriched by this? And it's likely going to be some people's lives will be improved and the rest of ours will be demolished, or at least diminished by their gains, right?
Right. And I think that it's oversimplifying a little bit, but I think that the answer, or at least the beginning of the answer to this question of, going back to what I was saying before, whose rationality, whose vision of science, and then therefore whose vision of morality, whose traditions are we appealing to, whose shared set of moral teachings are we appealing to? That question,
and this evolves with every society that's ever existed.
Yeah. And the best case scenario is that we make the responsibility and we place the power for making those kinds of decisions in as many hands as possible, so that it's very, very decentralized, in the same way that I think that political power, like ordinary kind of everyday political responsibility, that kind of power, and economic power, I mean, the more you have it distributed in the hands of smaller and smaller groups or individuals, the less likely, and the less not just the likelihood in terms of chance, but the fewer opportunities there are for people to abuse that power, whether it's economic or political or moral. I don't think that...
Yeah, the more you diffuse something, the less power it has. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. I don't think that the Roman Catholic Church is responsible for so many crimes, great and small, because of what it believes, which is, I think, what Sam Harris would argue. I think, there's certainly an element of that, but the Roman Catholic Church, as an institution, whether we're talking about the persecution of so-called heretics, or the Crusades, or they're talking about the child sex abuse scandals of the last 30 or 40 years, which actually go back further than that. A lot of those are just the material results of having this non-transparent, hyper hierarchical, and just deep and complex power structure that can only really be comprehended from the inside, and the power is so radically centralized. I think that, much more so than any actual beliefs it genuinely holds, or its members genuinely hold or pretend to hold, is responsible for the abuse of power. And I think the same thing could be said about the United States government, which on paper probably has some of the most benevolent values of any government that's been established, but we all know that that's not how things have played out in practice. So.
Well, that's just basically reiterating the idea that the more power is centralized, the more it's going to be abused, but also in the sense of the more authority is centralized in deciding right and wrong, the more that's going to be abused and justified, and in the hindsight ignored and kind of swept under the rug, right?
Right.
One of the interesting things that this really made me think about a lot was, you kind of touched on it earlier in terms of the context of free will and how much are you responsible for your own decisions, not only decisions, but the morality of your decisions, is how much does intent influence the morality of the action, right? If your intent is malicious, is a good, otherwise pure action bad? Or if your intent is pure, is an otherwise malicious action evil? Does that make sense?
Yeah, to what extent, if any, does intention play in our evaluation of this other person or this other party's evaluating like the moral righteousness or the degree of good or evil that their action carries, right? which I think that if we're on one version of rationality, it's like if we're trying to get just kind of like a purely materialistic and trying to be as purely objective as possible in the sense of only accounting for what we can all mutually observe, then maybe intentionality should count for very little. But I think if we appeal to those other kind of non-rational values of, again, human solidarity, tradition, any of those kinds of things that are very touchy-feely and very much not grounded in science, then we would take intention into account very much, because we don't condemn the cold-blooded murderer more than someone who kills in the heat of passion, because somehow the act itself has fewer devastating consequences. In fact, it could have more devastating consequences. We make that judgment because if someone kills a loved one because of some kind of betrayal or infidelity, we can relate to it, exactly. That's not a rational choice necessarily, and in fact it might actually be counterproductive, because you could make, again, a very kind of calculating, materialistic, in the philosophical sense, argument that it's the people who kill on impulse that we have the most vested interest in removing from society, because those are, even more so than sociopaths,
because they don't have as much control.
Which a serial killer probably has more self-control than someone who just often killed their spouse because they see a phone number in their cell phone they don't recognize. So, but we're more sympathetic to the jealous spouse than to the Jeffrey Dahmers or the Ted Bundys of the world, simply because we can relate to them more.
Well, this makes me really sympathetic towards religious activists in a way. Like if you take a Westboro Baptist Church protester who's going to bigot gay marriage or a gay soldier's funeral or something, like that's objectively, I suppose I shouldn't say objective in the context of the conversation, but that's obviously what we would consider reprehensible behavior. But from their perspective, if you're a Christian and you believe in their God, against whom if you sin you're going to burn for eternity, then their goal is not to make other people feel bad. Their goal is to save their soul. And obviously that's so statistically unlikely to the point of we might as well treat it as irrelevant. But from their perspective, they're doing a wonderful thing. They're not doing a terrible thing. They're trying to save someone for eternity. You can't have a more benevolent cause than that.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly how Harris would see that, is that they begin with a false, and not from this essay but just from other things that he's written, that they begin with a false set of beliefs about the nature of reality.
Sure.
And they proceed from there. And again, I can't prove rationally that that's not the way things are, but everything in my instinct and experience tells me that people like the Westboro Baptist Church, who, as a side note, their influence and their numbers are drastically blown out of proportion by the amount of press coverage.
I'm just using them as an example.
But they're the ones. That's what I'm saying. They're the example we can all kind of reach for. They're basically it's like a bunch of people who are related to each other. But I don't think that they really give a damn about the souls of American soldiers or gay people or non-Christians or whatever. I think they begin with a sense of rage and a sense of hatred for people, and they begin with a kind of unarticulated moral and existential nihilism, and then they mold the religion to give them an excuse to attack things that they feel disgusted by for reasons that have nothing to do with rationality or even the specific teachings of any religion, much less theirs.
By all means. I don't want the impression to be given that I was advocating for their behavior.
No, not at all.
Obviously, I understand it's terrible, and I'm sure the majority of those people, at least a significant relevant percentage of them, are acting out of bigotry and moral superiority and this, that the sense that they know better. But I'm sure some number, almost invariably, feel that they're doing a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I think And I think that there is an enormous amount of emotional and psychological satisfaction that people get by standing up and finding the courage in themselves to stand up to, you know, forces that are much larger than they are. And I think that thrill of kind of moral combat exists for all of us, independent of the validity or the justice of the cause that we throw ourselves behind. So certainly they get that feeling. And I think what you're saying was absolutely correct. Like at some point in their minds, they have begun to think that they are doing a wonderful thing. But I think they had to get there. They didn't start with the belief and then say, you know, this is what it's going to demand to save these people's souls. Which again, I think, and I don't think in that respect they're any different than any of us. They have these instincts, they have these moral presuppositions, they have these subjective preferences about how the world should be. Certain things disgust them, certain things appeal to them, certain things outrage them, certain things are comforting to them, and they just begin with that instinct that they can, you know, probably totally unable to really describe in any detail, and they work backwards from there, trying to mold a worldview that justifies the feelings that were always there to begin with. Sam Harris, I think, thinks that you can do it the other way, that you can look at the world objectively and rationally and then arrive at an appropriate system. I don't think that you can.
No, I don't think so either, especially because I don't think your intellect can override your guttural response for the most part. It's usually the other way around has to happen, which is unfortunate, but yeah.
Even if it did, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't notice. We wouldn't have no way of showing that we actually had overridden our...
Sure.
Unless it's on some really quotidian, you know, question about, you know, something that is the bare bones of the physical reality of the world, you know, like something as fundamental as gravity or something like that. But I don't think any of us have really strong subjective feelings about the physical world that turn out to be objectively false. Like, I don't think there are many people out there who, you know, who aren't mentally ill who think that, you know, gravity doesn't exist. I mean, that could probably be demonstrated to them, but you know, that's not the really realm of experience that we're getting into when we're getting into morality and ethics and all these other good and evil and all these other things that Harris is trying to get us to think about. I don't know. Was there any place in the essay that kind of stuck out to you? So we're not just talking about it in general, like a particular passage that either for good or for ill seemed to represent either a strength or a weakness in his argument overall?
Well, I've been thinking about the trolley problem and the shallow pond problem, and I don't know exactly. I mean, those are really strong examples of how can you argue that this is not a morally superior situation to the opposite. However, it doesn't take into account personal accountability or lack of cause of the situation, right? I mean, you're familiar with both of these examples, I assume.
Right. I think most people's response to things like the trolley problem are just to shoot the philosopher. But
yeah,
no, I know what you mean. Yeah. But yeah, it's and he does seem to not rebel entirely against, but seems to have a strong mistrust of these kind of utilitarian moral arguments. You know, the best outcome for the largest number of people. On the other hand, if you have nothing else to go on, I think most people would make the decision to just try to save as many people as possible.
No, of course. I mean, you can make a case. You can make a very strong case that that's objectively the superior position you're supposed to take, which is probably, I think, the most compelling argument he can make is when you can get situations like that where you just have numbers, where you can say X number of lives are more valuable than Y number of lives, so long as X is larger. Obviously, it doesn't take into account, or it forces you to at least consider, well, does everyone's life have the exact same value, or are some lives more valuable than others, and who's going to make that distinction? If you're going to kill one person as opposed to 5, if that one person was absolutely brilliant and those 5 people were just, you know, kind of your average whoever, is the world a better place if you killed 1 instead of 5? And who are you to make that distinction, which one is better?
Exactly, and that's the question. We got right to it. It's not really about which choice, it's about who has the power to make the choice. That's probably the more important moral question. I think most people are not really thinking about which choice is right. They're thinking about which choice is less bad, because if they're putting themselves in this thought experiment before they arrive at any conclusion, I think most of us feel like it's just, we would, not only that we wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't want to be put in this position, because obviously we wouldn't, but that we don't really have the necessary authority to make the right choice. We just have to make a choice. And again, that's the thing that lends itself to the utilitarian answer. It's not really a genuine calculation about saving the most number of lives, or, you know, thinking about the, you know, trying to measure the value of one life versus the other. It's just it's the one that's going to be the least morally troubling in the long run. But I think that you know, anytime you start talking about the value of life, of human life, and then the value of individual lives measured against each other, you know, now it's not just a question of philosophy or rationality or just even kind of moral reasoning. It's a question of authority and power, and who has the power to make those decisions.
Yeah, for sure.
And that to me is the reason that I feel good about affirming, in most cases, the equal value of all human life categorically, as opposed to looking at the individual character or merits or talents or intelligence of everyone, because I don't want anyone else making that decision, so I'm not going to take it upon myself to make those decisions either.
Well, that's an interesting. You don't think that there's any way that we could measure the value of one human being's life over another one? I mean, obviously that sounds like a horrible thing when I say it out loud, but are there not at least somewhat reasonably objective ways to discern that, like, Einstein is more valuable than, you know, random person off the train?
Yes. I mean, I think that if we put ourselves, again, in this kind of thought experiment territory where we're thinking about, you know, famous people or people that we know, I mean, if everyone just closes their eyes and pictures 5 acquaintances, they know exactly, if they have to kill one of them, who it's going to be, probably.
Well, it's good to know. It's good to know you've thought about that.
Yes, but again, we might not know as much about them as we think, and of course, if we really want to put ourselves in the old time machine situation, you know, if we're going to go back in time and you know, kill Joseph Stalin or kill Albert Einstein, like, most of us would definitely kill Stalin, I would hope.
Yeah, I would hope so.
But if you know, you and I are asking this question, you know, 40 years from now in the nuclear wasteland, and
would Einstein have been better to kill?
Part of the last 400 people that haven't been, you know, we're all just waiting to die of radiation poisoning. Maybe we would go back and
kill Einstein instead.
Kill Einstein. Yeah. Just hopefully, maybe the nuclear bomb would never been developed. So it's, again, we all feel, and I think correctly for the most part, that certain lives have more value than others from our perspective, but that feeling is not necessarily one that we should trust. And certainly, even if we trust it in ourselves, I think it would be foolish to trust other people's kinds of judgments on those same questions. Not just because they might be wrong, or they might not have the necessary, or they might not have a very thorough picture of the situation, but because when you're talking about a bunch of people making a decision, that's different than just you or I individually thinking, oh yeah, this person who's like a preschool teacher, and this person who is just like a dude that does a bunch of cocaine and messes with financial instruments that no one understands. Like, I'll definitely kill him and, like, let this school teacher live. You know, once we get a bunch of people in a room trying to make those kind of similar moral judgments, even if they're not life and death, it becomes a different situation, because now it's not just about the case in question, it's about the relationship between all those people trying to make the decision in the first place. So
I think you touched on something that I think we talked about earlier a little bit, but morality is also a function of time and the period in which you're living. I've used the time machine example for Stalin or Einstein, but I think it's a lot of it has to do with the fact that we all think of ourselves as living in the time to be alive. Right, and we never think of ourselves as being the ancestors of future generations.
Right.
We only think of it as like, well, all time has been leading up to us, and it's really not only unfair, but I would say it's immoral for us to make moral distinctions that, well, we know what's right, and then cast aspersions on previous generations for how could they possibly have done this. But when we, which I think is completely fair and logical to do, but does that let past generations off the hook for terrible things that they've done? I mean, how can we? It's easy to look back and say, well, slavery was objectively horrific, but is there a lens that we can look through at that previous generation that thought it was okay and forgive them a little bit?
I mean, again, I think it is just a question of human sympathy and human solidarity. I don't think that we have anything to lose by, and there's a difference between kind of forgiveness in the abstract and excusing the crimes or the mistakes of earlier generations. But I also don't think there's any good reason to put the dead on trial,
for sure,
really, unless it's some kind of immediate circumstance, or unless they're immediate political successors have power, or really it should be the successors then that we are confronting. I don't mean that we shouldn't take down statues of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. Like, we probably should take those statues down. We definitely should. On the other hand, there's a lot of space between that and some kind of dark age caricature of where we dig up the dead body and like put the dead body on trial or something. Which there's a certain kind of emotionally hysterical, kind of Tumblr kid leftist that almost really wants to do that with like every generation of people that wasn't as woke as they are, which would be pretty much everyone. Which that's kind of just, that's just like an emotional black hole. There's no real value for anyone who's still alive in doing that. Once you've taken the monument down, and once you've condemned the worldview of that person, and you've condemned it as forcefully as you can, you try to get other people to condemn it with you. That's the thing that will actually change the present for the better.
This is just your way of explaining you're against reparations, right?
Yes. Which I'm saying the South will rise again, the lost cause will live forever. No, and I think that I also don't think that we can assume that history has a moral dimension. So I hate two expressions that are totally part of the conventional wisdom, especially right now. They seem, these cliches won't die for some reason. The dustbin of history and the right or wrong side of history. History's not over yet, so you don't fucking know. Shut up. We don't know. I'm pretty confident that slavery is evil. But I'm definitely cautiously optimistic that slavery is not going to come back anytime soon. Even though it totally exists still now.
Yeah, it does. It's just like called different things.
And also, and sometimes it is just straight up slavery. But chattel slavery as existed in the Old South, I don't see that making a comeback. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that if we're talking about the time span between now and the next 5,000 years. That anyone who is anti-slavery at any point is somehow going to be on the right side of history. I think it's better just to be on the right side of the moral question, independent of the judgment of our ancestors. Like, if you think it's wrong, you're not betting on the approval or disapproval of your descendants. You're betting on its kind of, again, even if you don't have like a supernatural view of God or some kind of other judge of the cosmos, you're just betting on that, like, this was the right decision because your conscience wants you to make the right decision or be on the right side of some question. So I don't think history has any moral shape. I think it's just a series of either random events or events that are predetermined by forces outside of our power. So defeating historical forces decisively like, communism is in the dustbin of history. That's dumb. And thinking that we've settled some kind of moral or political question and the people who were on the other side were on the wrong side of history, that's also dumb and arrogant, and also not the right way to think about these kind of moral questions.
Well, yeah, for sure. I think the best way to summarize that is no matter what we do, our kids are going to hate us, right?
Our kids probably. Our grandchildren, maybe not. Our great-grandchildren probably won't give a damn one way or the other. I know about you, but like I blame the boomers for a lot of stuff. I'm sure the Jazz Age generation fucked up shit too, but it just doesn't weigh on me as much, Like I never wake up. I never like look at, I don't think
it's not as fresh for you.
I don't think anyone like looks at, every month when they're, they get their statement about how much student debt they still have, and they're thinking about, the flappers. They have some really sophisticated argument for why it's really
screwed things
it really
up.
was like the late Victorians that really got us into this mess. If you really think about it. I mean, yeah, of course there are some kind of political thinkers that want to point to some moment in history where things went wrong, so conservatives will say, depending on how conservative they are, things went wrong, the French Revolution, or things went wrong during the Enlightenment, or things went wrong during the Reformation. And people on the left would, point to World War One, or actually people on the right and left could point to World War One. I think there's a pretty good case to be made that was a giant misstep in human history. But again, those are just thought experiments. Those are just ways of putting a concrete face on these moral questions. Our ability to affect them is non-existent. So we're not really talking about those events. We're talking about how can we try to anticipate similar events in the future, even though we can't really predict them with any kind of certainty.
I think we should probably start wrapping this up, right? Is there anything is there any thing from this essay that we kind of touched most every point, I think, that your takeaway from it?
Yeah, I think that, again, like at the end of it, I just sort of felt like there were some things he said that, if not truisms, I agreed with them in the sense that, yes, I want people to talk seriously about good and evil and right and wrong as if they exist, but I still don't see why we need to drag science and rationality into it. I don't think that's helpful. And he says something like, I would further add that the concept of well-being captures everything we can care about in the moral sphere. Like, I don't know, everything.
Yeah, I wrote that down too.
Everything in me rebels against those kinds of generalizations. And he also says in the thought experiment, when he's talking about Adam and Eve, that, how can they maximize their well-being? Clearly, there are ways they can. Wrong answer number one, they can smash each other in the face with a large rock. I mean, there are lots of other philosophers out there. If you read someone like Emile Cioran or someone like that, yeah, that's exactly what they should have done. They would have spared all of us the trouble of having existed. That would end all suffering right at the beginning. Just nip it in the bud. Put it. I mean, and that also is like a totally. Why would you use the example of Adam and Eve when the whole purpose of the story of Adam and Eve is that they make a mistake and everything goes wrong for everyone, and that one mistake can condemn an entire species for its entire history. Which, regardless of how you treat a story like that, the sense that we are constantly being burdened by the mistakes of our ancestors rings true in a literary sense, at least, in the level of kind of affections and impulse, or instinct rather. I don't know. How about you? Were there things that we didn't talk about or that we didn't get to?
No, we covered pretty much everything. It's just really, I wish he left room for being wrong, which is something I think he does a lot. Is he comes to these conclusions of, well, here's all the evidence that points to why there's a conclusive reason why my position is correct, without offering any leaving any room for the possibility that, well, there's always some element of unknown. And my takeaway from the Adam and Eve example is like, well, unless in the off chance that Christianity was right, then exactly, like, death would have been a sweet release. Like, it wasn't exactly, it would have prevented all human suffering. That's a much better way to put it. Mm-hmm. But then they would have gone to heaven and be with God. Like, I'm not saying that that's what would have happened. We shouldn't operate from that position, but I don't understand how a guy can have that much confidence, because I never have that. I'm always willing to believe that I'm wrong. So
And I think that you're right, and it is like a feature of his style of self-presentation. I think it's why he rubs so many people the wrong way. It has less about what he says, although what he says, especially about Islam and American foreign policy and stuff like that, does anger a lot of people with some degree of justification. Although I still think he maybe gets attacked more than he should. But yeah, his kind of cavalier indifference to the possibility that no one knows anything and that we're all just, even rationality itself is just a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to make sense of a world that's always going to be beyond our comprehension. I think most people just kind of distrust that type of positioning in any writer or thinker or public intellectual for good reason. Definitely, I don't have anything approaching, and it actually, in terms of like the affected confidence or the seemingly like the inability to let doubt creep in the picture. I mean, this essay did in a weird way. Maybe this is kind of a cheap shot and too obvious given what Sam Harris is famous for, but it did almost remind me of religious apologetics. Like it starts with some fundamental belief about what is right and what is true, and then it acts as if the argument is circling back to establish that belief as true.
Sure.
Which I think is actually a caricature of religious apologetics, because religious apologetics they exist to make the system comprehensible to people within it and to people outside it who are sympathetic and attracted to it. It's not really meant to persuade. It's meant to explain and to kind of delineate how the system works. And if that was the way Harris presented this, he was like, hey, all of us secular atheists, like on science and rationality, we can't really establish the validity of things that we all instinctively care about on a purely rational basis. But here's how we can get pretty close. Like if he just presented it that way, I think it wouldn't have been news to anyone, but it would have been more. I would have been more sympathetic.
Hey there. While you're listening to this podcast or other Jester Radio Network podcasts, check out yesiamshow.biz and take a look at everything we do, from stand-up trivia to comedy, music, and more. Sign up for our mailing list at yesiamshow.biz.
Well, that was our conversation about. I think when Sam Harris hears this, he's going to be really upset that he was rebuked by a much superior podcast than his own. Right?
That's what we're going to title this episode. Josh and Joe own Sam Harris in all caps. And then it's and this is going to be like a really dumb picture of him and the little graphic of just like looking, like kind of squinting and looking weird. We'll just like find like a really embarrassing screen grab from one of his talks.
We could add like a black eye to him or something.
Yeah, we'll like Photoshop. Yeah. It'll be like it'll be real embarrassing for him. And of all of the ire and the rivalries and the anger, great and small, that he's ever incurred from anyone else on the internet, this will be the one where he just says "fuck it" and he just goes and joins a Buddhist monastery.
He's just gonna retire. Yeah, for sure. How do you think it went?
I think it went well. I feel good about it for the most part. It's all I can say is that I found it interesting, and I enjoy talking about this kind of stuff. Whether people will enjoy listening to it is a separate question, but well,
that's the whole concept of the show, and maybe that should just be the name of the show, is whether people enjoy listening to this. That's another question.
Yeah, that'll be the subtitle. Josh and Joe own Sam Harris, but if anyone enjoys listening to it, it's a separate question.
But these are the exact kind of conversations like I want us to be having, and I'm glad this just wasn't a dissection of what he wrote, but it's a much more rich conversation about what is morality and where do we get it from, and we didn't just debate what he wrote, we also debated the concept of moral relativism as a whole.
Right. I agree. For all of the things that I'd said negative about Sam Harris, I think that he didn't write this essay so that people would agree or disagree. He wrote it so they would, use it as a launch point for a larger discussion. And I think that, discussion as opposed to like debate, agree or disagree for or against, is definitely where we want to go. Which means that, the essay is always a starting point, and then we just take it where we decide to take it, that's our reaction to the essay. So,
For sure. All right. Anything else you want to add before we let them go? You could say no.
I guess I could say no, man. I thought something would just come to me, like another, like it's just like a bon mot. Did you have anything else you want to say?
No. I think we kind of covered everything. I mean, I wish I had more things to say, but we kind of covered all the grounds I really wanted to cover,
Cool.
and I think as the conversation went, I think we got into some good territory.
Yeah.
And I'm glad how it went. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Sweet, man.
All right. Well, thanks for listening.
Yep. Thanks for listening. Goodbye, everyone.